Okay, so I think I got that all right. Tonight, I'm a little late, and that's because I'm all over the board on what I'm doing today. I got into the mindset of looking up some research for some writing that I was working on, and before you know it, several hours go by. And I'm willing to bet that tonight I'm going to be all over the place working things. Probably I might be awake for a day and a half because I did some taste tests today, and what I did taste tests of were drinks. And apparently, before I did a little research on what I was doing, this particular drink that I taste tested today has 300 milligrams of caffeine, which is about 3 cups of coffee. And I did another drink on top of that that had about 60 milligrams of coffee or caffeine in it. So I'm in the last several hours, I have consumed probably 4 cups of coffee worth of caffeine, or the equivalent of 2 of those 5-hour energies. So I'm going to start seeing colors that aren't there soon, I think. I did not realize that was going to happen. Did some taste tests, and I was like, oh, this looks like an interesting flavor, and it is tasty, but I may have enough fuel to do a fair amount tonight. We'll find out how that goes. That's going to be fun. But also throughout the day, I've been working on some of the writing for some of my projects. And I need to do some more editing of videos to post. I did some recording of videos, and I did some research into some of the game design stuff. So one of the things I was looking at was the information for, I think it's the Game Crafters website. When I was talking about doing I'm starting to really feel the Game Crafters website has the design elements for building your own board games and stuff. When I was talking about the game I was working for the board game last night, I was thinking about switching from the card to the dice for playing the game. The thing I found when doing the research for that was, if I'm doing that during gameplay, if you roll the dice for the interactions and you have, like, say, five or six dice for the interaction and roll them, and you use that to resolve any combat or enemy layers. 5 or 6 custom dice through Game Crafters. It's like $6 to $7 per custom die on Game Crafters. So 6 of those already starts to put you in the price range of $30, with a board and cards and plaques for each character, and mini markers for moving, and any other additions that I would end up doing. That's going to be a whopping expensive game, and I don't know that it justifies it. And like I've said before, every time I've made a game, I'm not really keen on building a game that's going to cost, $120 to play. But doing the research, like, if I just swapped out the dice for a small deck of cards, like a deck of cards that would get you the same, that would get you 26 cards, roughly 20 to 26 cards, that you would use in the same way that you would use the dice. That deck of cards is like $1.60. And, for 6 dice to cost you almost $20 to $30 versus $1.60 for a deck of cards. As much as I want this to be a board game and not a card game, card play is probably the one that makes the most sense for how to do this. So I think I'm probably going to end up doing it as a card mechanic on the board game. which is okay. I mean, it sort of makes sense more for what I was doing anyway. Um, and looking at the card game that I was working on, the Captain Rita Raygun game. I think I'm gonna go back and forth on this a little bit. I think still, but the board game, I may make a Rita Raygun game, but because each of the players would get a different alien, like a Venusian princess or a Martian warlord or a Mercury character or a Earth or Moon character. Those characters in their gameplay aspects are not going to be Rita Raygun. So, like, maybe have the Rita Raygun appear as a non-player character or somebody who issues missions or something, but it gets harder and harder to figure out how that role fits in with the rest of the game, other than just it shares a setting. So that may not end up being called a Rita Raygun game. Don't know. I still want to because I think it would be a fun thing to include. But the card game is definitely the Rita Raygun game, and that one should be able to be done through game crafters because it is just essentially a deck of cards. So that one could be relatively cost effective to do through game crafters. And so, like, that one I can pursue pretty readily now. Going back to the board game, though, the figuring out the mechanics for a deck of cards versus a set of dice is a little tricky. Deciding which one makes the most sense. I kind of did a bunch of planning last night, and I don't know if I'm jumping around too much here because of the caffeine. I feel like we've only been going for 7 minutes, and I'm already rambling pretty rapidly. But the card game design aspect of it has some advantages, but doing some of the research and planning last night that I did, I was noticing a couple ways I can do the motion on the game, like the moving around the solar system map. And part of that is based off of a game that I enjoyed when I was younger, where it was like a miniature model, like model spaceships or pirate ships that you moved around. And movement was dictated by essentially like energy. So you have energy enough to move 4 spaces, or you can move like 2 spaces. Turning on a spot costs you 1 movement. So if you wanted to move and turn 90 degrees, you would do 2 moves, 1 move for rotating off the straight line, and then if you wanted to fire a weapon, that would be an additional energy use. So I kind of think that mechanic might work for gameplay. Not sure yet. I'd give it a try. The other thing I'm a little curious about with that is the rocket ship design was really meant as how to get you from point A to point B. So you would go from the asteroid belt to Mars to Venus to the moon, and the encounters would be had there. But I feel like also being able to have encounters on the map, where if you're in the asteroid belt, you encounter, or halfway between Mars and the asteroid belt, you encounter a tile that's an encounter tile. Being able to do that would be something you have to have a non-dungeon encounter role for, or card play. But also the possibility of characters being in an alliance, like players having an alliance, as well as characters being able to combat one another during gameplay. So if the two of us were playing, instead of forming an alliance, we might oppose one another. If we did that at some point, it might be valuable to be able to say, like, you got a clue, and instead of going through a dungeon to get a clue from one of the villains of the episode, I could steal your clue. Then in order to do that, do I want to do a spaceship combat mode? And if I do that, what's the best way to do that? And so I feel like that movement and rocket ship weapons like lasers makes sense. So being able to do the energy level of the ship between encounter locations is a valuable way of doing like movement and weapons fire. And trying to think like some of the other aspects of I did a little research on the Vampire Hunter game last night and looked through the rules and figured out some of the ways to do some of those encounters. It's like a compromise between the Vampire Hunter and Eldritch Horrors. So there's some ways to do that make sense. The trick with the Vampire Hunter game is when you encounter things along the board, some of them are just, they're unknown encounters. One might be a tool that you can use, one might be an innocuous thing, and one might be a villain or a monster that you have to fight. And there is a mechanism in that game where each of those tiles are two different things in one. And depending on whether it's day or night, the tile changes. So like a regular villager during the daytime might be a werewolf at night. And fog, which is meaningless during the daytime, turns into a vampire at night. And a regular gravestone turns into a zombie at night. And there are hazards on the board that you can encounter that appear at night, but not during the day. There's a bunch of those little changes in mechanics, and it doesn't work as well to have that little gimmick of switching between day and night and have things appear and disappear during different parts of gameplay, unless there's another mechanic to do that. Hang on, I gotta go do something. I'll be right back. Goodness. Be right back. I gotta go take care of something. All right, so Okay, let's not knock anything over. Yeah, there shouldn't be any. I think that's about 12 feet off the ground. So if you got a peeping Tom coming in there, it's Slender Man. That would be an interesting event. So, was I gone for probably a minute or so? It felt like longer than that. I hate running away for like setting up a live feed and then walking off screen for a minute or two. Feels like I was gone forever. But so looking at I've got so many things open right now. The other thing I've been doing all day is reconfiguring my new laptop to do as much as I can on this, because I had a panic attack the other day. I think we had a small power outage, and my other computer, the screen cut out, and I thought I'd lost the ability to access everything on my hard drive on the other computer. And so when I got it working again, in panic, I transferred all the important files onto my external hard drive and connected my external hard drive to this computer so that I could, back up on 2 different formats the same information and get all the I want to call them bookmarks. There you go. All the bookmarks on all my browsers, and set up all the settings so that I can access all my accounts from this laptop in case everything else fails. So being able to go and get to accounts that I've set up with Game Crafters or some of my other accounts that let me do the stuff I need to do to create things like my DeviantArt, I can access now from this laptop and send files to make prints of artwork that I do, which is something previously I only had set up on the other computer. If I lost that capability, I'm sure I could gain it back, but it's better to do the work now when I have the opportunity. But looking at the files that I've been working on for this game design, so Captain Rita Raygun's thrilling and interplanetary adventures, I've sort of broke it down into its basic form of rules. Is a judge puts down story element cards for the villain, the MacGuffin, and event cards, and the player use cards to build a tale using those aspects to make a short, like, tavern tale sort of story. And that one's pretty straightforward. I feel like the biggest thing I have to figure out is narrowing down what's the right number of cards for players to start out with. So if you have 3 players, does everybody get like 9 cards to start with? And then the judge pulls 3 cards off the top of the deck and lays them out and establishes basically the judge, or I want to name it something other than judge. So it would be like the I don't know, like would it be the historian of events, or the record files, or I don't know. I have to figure that one out. What makes sense for the retro future Ray-Gun Gothic style storyline? But anyway, the judge lays out the cards and establishes this. Do you guys know the story of Captain Rita Raygun and Ming the Merciless's plot to conquer the world with to conquer Mars with the sacred Venusian goblet of fire or some such thing? And then each of the players, oh, do you mean this story? And they lay out how, the events happen and the objects used in the course of the story, and then include all the parts that the judge laid out, but in a story of their own making, and using their own cards to tell the other parts of that story. That's pretty straightforward. I think the biggest thing to figure out at that point is how many cards each player has to start with. Do you draw back to that number of cards for each hand? And is it, how many hands do you win in order to win the whole game? Or do you use up the whole deck? What's the winning qualifier? And then I think that's really just those are the big things that need to be figured out on that. And how many cards per deck. And then I have to really just come down to naming each element of the cards. So I come up with 7 to 12 villainous characters, 7 to 12 MacGuffins, and then it's sort of like that'd be 24 cards to start with, and then the rest of the deck should be events, minions, and minions, I think, for the most part. I might do person, places, things, actions, and events. That makes some sense. And if I did, say, 12 for each, or 10 for each, that would just be 50 cards right there. In my experience, for 3 to 5 players, you're mostly going to want sort of like a tarot deck sized deck of cards. So somewhere in the range of 72 to 78 cards is sort of what you want for a bare minimum. And, the possibility in gameplay of keeping those decks mixed, keeping the deck mixed of all of those elements, could be that, and if the judge flips over 3 cards at random, what they're going to end up with is you might get a story where you have 3 objects instead of a villain and an event. You have 3 objects, and I have to play test that to sort of see if that breaks the storytelling mode too much. I don't think it would have to. I think you could tell the story of Rita Ray guns and the 3 objects. I think that's doable. And it's also possible to have no objects, no MacGuffins and no event cards, just 3 villains and some, I guess we shouldn't call them villains. They may be allies, or you're trying to arrange a diplomatic connection between 3 characters. So people, places, things. Could you get 3 places? And how would you connect them in a story? I think part of the fun of any storytelling game style like that would be that, like, it's the challenge of telling a story with your hand of 7 to 9 cards, using the heart, like somebody lays down 3 places. And it's like, that's a hard story to tell, but if you can do it, you're a good storyteller and you deserve the win on that one. I think, the openness to being able to do a really hard hand makes this type of game really versatile. I like this style of game build, so I think really doing the people, places, things, actions and events, I guess. Um, that sort of setup for cards should be enough to make a really good that could make a really good, versatile, simple game to start with. So I think that I need to I need to make some notes here, but um, I think that's all I need for that one is just to figure out the names on the cards for and perhaps the ratio of uh, people, places, and things, and events and actions. Actions and events. Do I need any other category for storytelling? I feel like I might even be more careful with actions and events because if you build people, places, and things as your main decks, the the storytellers, so like the game judge, the round judge, and the other players fill in the actions. But having a few actions in there probably won't hurt. So if I did actions and events as 10 cards each and did people, places, and things as more likely to be 20 cards each, that's 60, 70, 80 cards. That gets you closer to the 78. Um, it gets you 80 essentially. And that seems like a decent ratio. Now it just sort of comes down to figuring out how many cards per hand per player and the play and draw mechanism. So if you build a story, you say you have 7 to 9 cards in your hand and you spend 4 of them to tell the story with the 3 that the judge lays down. Do you draw the exact number you played or do you draw the same like when I built Runcible Foods, one of the mechanics we found during gameplay, during playtesting, was it added an element of strategy to gameplay to have the player. You start with 3 cards, and the judge puts down 1 card, and you try to make food combinations that are unappetizing. And if you don't think you could do a good job with 2 or 3 of the cards out of your hand, then only put down 1 card. At the end of every round, no matter who wins, everybody draws 2 cards. So if you only spend 1 card, you start the next round with 4 cards. And so you have an advantage of higher number of cards in your hand for the next round. If somebody says, "Well, I could win this hand, but to really make sure, I can spend all 3 of my cards." But if you do that, your next round you only have 2 cards. So you have a decreased chance in your next round. But it's also a good way to wipe out your hand if you've got a bunch of garbage cards in your hand. So it's a way of putting strategy into how many cards you play each round. So it's an interesting mechanic. The question is, in this version of the game, did I mention? Oh, there's a game that the game that I was using for reference for the board game was Vampire Hunter. There, it's a little hard to figure out which one you're getting when you do a search for that online, but there's a site called let's see, what is it called here? You can look up boardgamegeek.com and see if I can get you the link here in the comments. Copy and then go back here. And you can research the rules and sometimes images and photographs of board games, and it's good for doing research. But on the version of Vampire Hunters that I have and I've played, it has this. It has a castle tower in the center of the board that's actually a light, and you play the game in the dark and turn on the light, and the light has two colors. It has a red color and a blue color. And when the light is shining red across the board, all the red, like the pale red images on the board disappear because red light on red objects don't show up. But red light on blue objects give you a dark apparent line on the board. But if you hit the button on the top, it switches the light in the tower to blue. And the blue shines on the board and mixes with the red of events to give you a dark present image. And so red was supposed to represent the red of dawn or daylight, and the blue was supposed to represent the dark of night. And so you have a deck of cards and you flip those over during gameplay, and it changes whether or not it's like a random event happens that makes this happens during daytime. Yes, like the old trick ones where you slide the card into a sleeve and the red makes blue stand out as dark, but makes all the red parts disappear. It's sort of like that effect, but it's done with a light on a board. And on the board, there are areas where at certain points, the color of light makes a secret shortcut appear that you can take, or a trap that'll hold you in place until daylight comes along and makes the trap disappear, or turns the gravestones into zombies, turns the mist into vampires, or the villager into werewolves. And so each of those aspects, it's a neat gimmick for the gameplay, but it's a mechanism that I don't necessarily want to have to include in my board game version of that. I think it sort of partially derails. Like it's a gimmick that demands you focus on it, and I think it can detract from the story event of the other type of gameplay. And the other thing I found is like having to play the game in mild darkness. It didn't always work right. If there's just a little too much light, it's hard to figure out what you're supposed to see. The other thing that was kind of neat was the dice for the game. The numbers changed whether it was day or night. So at night, like your rolls were less successful. So where during daytime, if you rolled the dice and you would get an 8, at nighttime, the best you could get was a 6. And at nighttime, there's a combat dice. You either hit or you miss. And like a hit is an instant kill of any opponent. But at nighttime, there are less opportunities to hit. I think I can't remember the combat die for sure, but so it was a neat gimmick. It could just as easily be achieved with the dice aspect by saying these are your night dice and these are your day dice, and you could easily set it up so that you don't have to have the battery powered light in the middle of it, and you don't have to play it in the dark. This is your day deck. This is your night deck of cards. And if you have the encounter spaces instead of being tiles that you set up on the board, and when you come in contact with them, you flip them over and they have an encounter. All you'd have to do is have markers on the board, and when you land on or next to one of those spaces, go to this deck during daytime, go to this deck during nighttime. And so you can circumvent that whole gimmick. It's just sort of like, it's a fun idea. It's neat for that game. I don't think that's one thing I want to use. I like the idea of the encounter spaces on the board. And I can basically take a similar design of that element, and instead of doing rooms in each quarter of a square board, I can lay them out, from this starting point through to the main doorway to the next room, just run them all out in a line. And instead of having certain areas of the room be like, here's the encounter location here, it's like, this is where Mars is, this is where Venus is, this is where Earth and the Moon are. And so I can set them up easily enough. So some of the mechanic of that makes sense, but I'm going to work around that. The Eldritch horror aspect. Let's see. I took a lot of notes as I did a little more research on gameplay rules last night. So in Eldritch horror, they have play sequence that is essentially every player has phase one is action phase, which includes 2 actions for every player. So resting, shopping, traveling, or character specific action, like your character has the ability to telegraph important information to one of the other players. So something like that. And then every player gets their 2 actions in a sequence. And then the second phase happens, and it's called the encounter, the location, or it's the encounter phase. And it's wherever you are on the board, you then have to interact with where you are. Now, the way they do this in the Eldritch horror game is every city on the map has its own deck. This is way more complicated than I really want to get. So I feel like sort of like a uniform deck of encounter cards, where I sort of want to use something similar to I keep wanting to call it hieroglyphics. No, the horoscopes, where you can be as vague as you need to be to communicate something happening or something important, but it's equally applicable to every location it could happen at. If you read a horoscope and it tells you like, oh, you're an intelligent person who's got anxieties about events in their life, and like, that's everybody. Like, if you literally just if you took all the descriptions from a newspaper horoscope and you jumbled them around under the different, Gemini, Cancer, Taurus headings, everybody who reads that would go, oh yeah, that fits perfectly with, I'm a Gemini and that makes so much sense for me. And they wouldn't know that that's, it originally was meant for somebody else. So if you do that and you use that kind of technique intentionally, I could build a single deck that would explain events happening anywhere on the solar system map. So I think that's one of the things I have to do. So that's the encounter phase in Eldritch Horror repurposed for what I need it to do. But the encounter phase, you draw a card from the deck of the character's location and resolve any challenges or combat that need to happen at that time. And then the last of the 3 phases in that game is what's called the Mythos phase. And you turn over the top card of the Mythos deck, and it's always something sort of like a new monstrous spawned, gates open. you advance the tracker for the monster, the main mystery monster of that game. And if the tracker reaches 0, the Ancient One arrives and destroys the world. So that tracker is something you're always paying attention to. And that Mythos card that flips over oftentimes advances that tracker, but also causes events like injuries or problems for the individual characters. I don't know that I want to do a traditional Mythos tracker, but there's another game that I've seen gameplay of, and it's like this is where it really starts to look like this isn't a direct port from Eldritch Horror to my retro future ray gun gothic game. It's literally just taking ideas from different games, breaking the rules, and combining them in new ways. And so one of the games that I've seen gameplay for was Marvel Legends, where you have this deck of villain cards and you flip over the first card and put it in place 5 or 6. And each round of gameplay, that card moves over one and a new one is flipped over behind it. And you need to defeat those villains before they get all the way to the end of the track. And if they get to the end of the track and then they're supposed to flip over into the next space, that villain gets away. And that's that sort of mechanism for advancing a course of bad events, I think is sort of what I kind of want to do for, like, if you do in my game where you have a plot of the arch villain of that game, you have a plot deck of villainous events, you know, uh, assassination of the Venusian prime minister, and you play that card out face down, and it advances along a track of 5 or 6 spaces. As you go around the board going to event locations, if you resolve whatever happens at that event location, say you beat a Martian mercenary, it gives you the ability to figure out part of the plot of the arch villain. So you can pull that card off that track so that it never happens. But if you don't get enough of those resolved in a sufficient amount of time, part of the arch villain's scheme happens. So I don't know if I made sense there, but essentially, like, around the board are encounter tiles as well as main bases or dungeons that you have to raid. And depending on your encounters or defeating mini bosses in dungeons, you get awarded the ability to uncover part of the overarching plot. And the overarching plot will be at the top of the board where they're all face down, and you get to claim one off that list so that it doesn't happen. And if, say, 3 to 5 of those happen, then the arch villain wins the game and everybody else loses. I don't know if that's particularly clear there, but I think that's sort of the way I want to do that. And that it's tricky, but it requires more play testing to make sure I get the mechanics working right. I usually like to do a fairly simple game design, so there's a lot less chance of game-breaking mechanics involved. But I like the way this works because it enables both cooperative and competitive gameplay to succeed at winning the game. So if you do a cooperative game where everybody's helping each other out, then you're competing to defeat the arch enemy or the arch villain of the game. But it's also possible to play competitive, and you can even play a game where you don't have an arch villain. And the randomization of events by the arch villain during gameplay also lets the game be replayable. It's not like the same story happens every time you play, so you already know what's happening. The randomization of events, the trick to doing that though is making the story make sense. So, like I said, assassination of the Venus Prime Minister is one potential event. Um, uh, Contacting Jovian uh, uh, arms dealers and acquiring a doomsday weapon, maybe another event. But if you have a deck of 12 different events, it's never going to be the same 3 to 5 that have to happen in order for the villain to win. So you get multiple times replayability in this game. And so I think that makes a really good mechanic. That's done with cards, most all of that. Motion and gameplay, I feel like the other thing I noticed about Game Crafters that I'm a little back and forth on is I did a research on customized dice for gameplay, and that was too expensive. But I couldn't tell, and I think I have to restart my account with them. I don't know if it's still open with them. Because I made my Runcible Foods game with them, and I should still have an account, but I'm not sure. The building of a game through Game Crafters has the possibility of doing customized dice, but I don't know if I built a game and just said, could you throw in a D6 in there and have that D6 be used to roll your energy for that round? If it's just a regular D6, do I still have to pay $6.50 for that die for that game, which raises the cost of the game? Whereas, like, I can go buy a set of like 20 D6s for like $1.50 from the dollar store or somewhere. Um, so if they have the possibility of just throwing in a D6 for 25 cents, that's doable in gameplay. Otherwise, I've got to figure out a way to mechanically allow characters to do their energy for movement and ship to ship combat in the solar system for the board game. But the dungeon, I call it dungeon because it's based off of the 5-minute dungeon game. But essentially, the villain, the mini boss layers that you encounter during gameplay, those are pretty straightforward card combat game mini games within the greater board movement and story narrative game. And I think I've got most of that figured out. I have to try building the villain arch villain's plot deck, and I have to figure out the right number of cards for hero combat, because I feel like it should be a deck of like 15 to 18 cards for each playable character. So that should be Mercury, Venus, Mars, the Moon, Earth. So maybe 5 different playable aliens, or humans and aliens. Spaceship markers. So 5 different decks of 20 cards, roughly. That would get you 100 cards for just the combat mode, placards for the mini bosses, a deck of minions, traps, and what were the qualifiers I had? Uh, I had all my notes are very confusing here right now. It's hard to read them while talking. Travel by tickets. No location cards for each. No lure. Huh. I thought I had that written down somewhere. Anyway, so um, the 5 modes of combat would be like ray guns, shields, like a shield belt or something like that. Fisticuffs, and like 1 or 2 other categories. Like one might be, I feel like some of it should be like puzzle solving. So like science or knowledge category for like things like traps or obstacles that you have to work past in the villainous lair, but also outwitting your opponent if you're against a person. So the opponents in gameplay would be, it's like people, obstacles, or events, I think. I think I might have actually deleted part of my file here. I'll have to look through it again later. It feels like I'm missing something. It might be over on the other computer, though. I'm not sure. But so resolving different types of events in gameplay. I believe it's each of the characters had a different aspect. Like in 5 Minute Dungeon, you had ninjas and paladins, and oh yeah, it was monsters, people, and obstacles were the 3 big ones. And then events could happen like injuries, and then like the thief had the ability to discard 3 cards, draw 5. So that would be something like a Martian has the ability to discard certain number of cards and draw a certain number of cards, or something to that effect. The paladin has the ability to beat 1 monster, and the ninja has the ability to beat 1 person. And so you have those capabilities. When confronting them, there were 5 categories. It was the sword, the shield, the arrow, the martial arts, I think, and the magic were the 5 categories of cards in 5 Minute Dungeon. So having something equivalent like that, like in this case, magic would be science, and so you're, or knowledge, and so they're outsmarting a trap or outsmarting a villain, a minion or a villain, and it might make sense to have monster cards, so like an alien beast on the planet. So the tentacle dogs of Mars versus um, Mars aerial combat commando. There are different types of players, different types of things that you have to overcome in the lair combat. So traps, minions, and monsters. And some of it might just be terrain, like caverns of Mars or acidic seas on Venus. And then, so that's sort of like figuring out how to get through locations. So that would be wit, would be magic or like knowledge or whatever. And then fisticuffs, ray guns might be your ranged. Shield belt, and I might just put a sword in there anyway, because a lot of those retro future stories have like a sword and a ray gun together. It's sort of like swashbuckling on rocket ships. So maybe like a plasma sword or something like that. I'm not sure there. And then, so that's sort of dungeon combat. I feel like you could get away with everybody having essentially the same deck for dungeon combat, but potentially changing that deck so that the Venusians have an advantage in ray gun technology or shield belt technology, and the Martians have advantage on swords, and Mercury has an advantage on one of the other categories. It's not really important which one at this point. I'll figure it out. But like, do I want to do a separate deck for each player? That's 5 decks of combat cards for each person. I could do 2 decks of 20 cards for the combat mode. And people share those decks? I don't know that that makes sense, though. If everybody's sharing like 2 decks for layer combat, I sort of feel like everybody should have their own deck. And doing that in such a way that, yeah, that makes more sense. And so then there's the Archvillains deck of events. Layer combat deck. What else do we need? Need the player placards. I got to figure out the energy used for travel and ship-to-ship combat. And I kind of like, I keep referring back sort of to my cyberpunk game. I like the idea that like your hand of cards for motion were also your defense and your attack and your currency. And so you get to decide how you want to ration your energy usage that way. I don't know how that would work. Like, we're already at the point where you handle 1 deck for layer encounters, and if your motion for your rocket ship is like 4 spaces and combat is, 1 to 2 cards get you the ability to fire, I don't know that it's a big enough deck to bother with. So I feel like that makes more sense to use dice for it. But honestly, if you set them, if you set each race to have a different movement or energy qualifier, um, so your defensive capabilities are one number, your motion is one number, and your attacks are another number, and you just have counters on your player's placard every time it's your turn. No, I think what I need to do is have a reactor number, a reactor value for each player. So, say the Venusians get a reactor value of 5. Lunar player gets 3. Um, you get to use your energy for motion or attack. Your shield value will be set. So you get to decide whether or not you put 3 points of reactor value into motion, or 1 and 2 into attack. So at that point, ship-to-ship combat is sort of done as a um, it's I think that makes the most sense. I can't have it be too big a gap between the fastest ship and the slowest ship ability, or I can't. It's not really faster or slow. I can't have a gap too big between the reactor values of any two ships. Because if one set of ships can only move 3 spaces, but the other can move 5 every turn, it's a huge disadvantage to the slower ships. And if they don't have some other um, compensation in their abilities, they have a bigger risk of being so unbalanced as to not have a lot of fun playing the game. So, like, Mercury is a smaller planet. I think of all the planets, Earth has the heaviest gravity. So, being used to being able to have to get the energy to get off planet, maybe we have more energy in our reactor, but Mercury uses less energy to move around because they're the lightest planet. So their reactors aren't built um, as powerful. So the energy they have for movement and attack is significantly less than ours. Do they then get an advantage, like the ability to um, what would I do to equal out the difference in that? To automatically have an advantage over something. I have to compensate if I give them each different reactor values. And I don't like using a die roll for reactor values because, like, in my brain, just narratively speaking, why would you on Tuesday be able to make, a one stellar unit distance traveled, but on Wednesday only be able to make 4. Like, if you roll a die and you roll a 1 one day and you roll a 4 the next day, like, it's the same reactor that's powering your ship. Why would you have a different value on different days? It just doesn't make narrative sense to me other than to add a element of randomness to the game. I don't think that makes a lot of sense narratively. I do think there's an element of having different values for different ships. But um, I feel like everybody having roughly the same ability to travel makes the most sense. It should be the shields and the attacks that have the variable. And I would say for that kind of thing, it makes more sense to have like a choose between. See, that's the trick though. If everybody moves 4 spaces per turn and you decide between, like, that's just a standard space movement. That doesn't have that ration your reactor's energy between motion and attack and defense. I really have to figure that part out. The motion and ship to ship combat, I think, is the one part of this game that I haven't quite figured out right yet. And I still have to, like, I have to decide. I think for the secret base combat system, that's ray guns, shield belts, fisticuffs, knowledge, and plasma swords or something like that. Energy swords. I think that makes the most sense. Um, and then ascribe values to mini bosses, to the main arch villain, and individual obstacles, monsters, and people, minions, monsters, and oh, I kind of want to make them all M's, just because alliteration is fun. Um, so like minions, monsters, and I don't want to do miscellaneous, but like traps and obstacles and landscape. All as sort of one category. I'll look into that. But so write that down because it makes the most sense to keep track of that. I don't know where some of my data went. Might be on the other computer, like I said. Okay, so minions, monsters, and so minions, monsters, and And 5-minute dungeons also had the event cards and mini bosses, which is essentially just a bigger monster. And then for the categories of objects, that would be ray guns, shield belts, fisticuffs, science, oh, smart. There might be a better way to phrase that. And then energy sword, I guess. I might rethink that one too. Fist. I might want it to be like ray guns is a ranged attack, shield belt is a defensive, fisticuffs is like melee or grappling, and science or outsmart would be the equivalent of magic. And what that really kind of leaves us with at that point is dodge, block, or evade. So fisticuffs might be my sword equivalent. So instead of energy sword, yeah, I'm thinking along the lines of that sort of joke. And if you've ever seen Galaxy Quest, the captain of the ship, Tim Allen's character, he does the thing where he's on the planet and he's trying to get closer to the monsters, and he rolls, and it's sort of a joke. I don't want to do too jokey with this, but invade. So this is essentially like a in equivalent of Dungeons and Dragons statistics. Your shield belt would be like how much. So fisticuffs, ray guns. So you have your strength, your dexterity, and your armor class, essentially. So armor, weapons, and movement, I guess. So that's interesting. It doesn't directly correspond with like Dungeons and Dragon stats. I was going to say I'm looking at armor class, strength, and dexterity, but it's not really that. Like fisticuffs and ray guns are two different types of attack, and like the science or outsmarting would be the equivalent of the intelligence and wisdom that wizards and clerics use, but that's not right either. It's its own system there. And I think setting it up, and I mean, I haven't played 5-minute dungeons, so I can't exactly copy their model anyway. So I do think having the block, dodge, or evade capability as a category of card that you play in a lair confrontation would be advantageous in situations where there are obstacles, um, or giant monsters, or something with an attack where it makes sense. Your ability to dodge or evade would be an advantage. Science would be puzzle resolving or outsmarting your opponent. Fisticuffs is just straight out fighting. Shield belt is protecting against an attack specific opponent. And ray guns is, if you were encountering flying insects, giant flying insects on Venus, a ray gun is more advantage than fisticuffs or outsmarting them, though dodge might be beneficial in that sense as well. So I think that's a good layout of capabilities. And let me know if I'm rambling at this point. We're an hour and 15 minutes in. Minion, monster, and obstacle are good categories, with the occasional event or a mini boss, maybe. I don't know that I want to do a lot of mini bosses. Events, I mean, it depends on how I make that happen. It might be something along the lines of like you contract Martian flu or something stupid like that. But I don't know that I want to do that a lot either. I like the minions, monsters, and obstacles. Mom. Minions, obstacles, and monsters. It's the mom. It's the mom deck. And then the deck for arch villain. Deck. Arch villain scheme deck would be, I'd say 3 to 5 have to get out the end. And you could change that up between games so that if you wanted to play a shorter game, you only have to get 3 of them out the end of the shoot. If you want to play a longer game with a bunch of friends, 5 to 7 maybe. And you could even play a game without an arch villain, which means that it's more than likely to be a player versus player game. PvP, play, possible, sends, arch villain. Or with it. I mean, you could do player versus player with an arch villain. Is it possible for a player to side with the arch villain? Maybe. I think for right now, though, just building the game as a cooperative against the arch villain or player versus player mode makes the most sense. Version 2.0 could be possibly expanding to do all sorts of pulp, sci-fi, or fantasy game settings where I can tweak it so that you can do a arch villain player versus player or a potential betrayal mode. And you could do that with a additional deck of player motivation. Like lay out a card that makes it possible for you to decide to side with the villain. It's you decide if you're going to pick the villain over the other players. It doesn't assign you. You have to commit to working with the villain. That might be something to do. So, like, I'll put that down as just a side note. Motive deck. Can allow siding with villain. And other than that, I have to figure out the motion. Got the combat worked out. I've got the combat for people worked out. Don't have the combat worked out yet for the spaceship and the motion. So moving and combat, dogfighting, I guess. Movement and dog bite. Question mark. I also feel like I kind of want to build into the game a mechanic for planets to move. I really, really like the idea of doing like the sun at the middle of the board. You put the deck down in the middle of the board. You put some of the decks in the middle of the board on the sun, and you have circular tracks that go around the sun for each of the planets, and say at different intervals. So like Mercury would turn every turn a certain distance, and Venus would turn every 2 turns, one space. Earth every 3, Mars every 4, something to that effect. And for additional complication, you could do the moon around Earth, moving at a different rate around the Earth. But like, that's a neat idea. I don't know how to make that executable. It does add a little bit of fun, because if you're trying to move from Mercury to Mars, there will be times when they're much closer to each other than other times. Well, they'll be so much further. It would be faster to go from Mercury to Earth than it would be to go from Mercury to Venus. So like, I like that idea. I don't know how I would manage that during gameplay without totally making this way more complicated than it needs to be. And board design, forget about it. Like, there's no way I'd be able to get this game made on Game Crafter that way. But I kind of like the idea. I got to figure out if there's a way to make that happen. For a future game, maybe. I don't know. So movement and dogfighting. I've got the Archvillain scheme deck kind of figured out. Potential motivation deck. Layer combat. So I've got to figure out I've got the going back to referring to the Eldritch Horror, there's the 3 different phases, which is the action phase, encounter phase, and mythos phase. The closest equivalent in my game would be the action phase would be space travel phase. The encounter phase would be combating in bases or encounters at spots on the board, like in the Vampire Hunter game. If you land on a space and it's a monster, you have to combat that, or it's an item and you can purchase that or get that or whatever you need to do. So encounter spaces or villain lair or secret bases phase, and that would be the one that you use your deck for combat. And then the closest to the mythos phase would be the main villain's scheme deck moving forward one, or uncovering the plot of the villain's scheme. Yeah, possibly. Now, the objective in a game of this competition, like, that's one of the things that it almost sounds like I've not addressed here. Like, we figured out that the villain, like the arch villain's track, if they get 3 to 5 off the end of the track, they win. How do the players beat the villain? I mean, in player versus player, you're beating the other player to something. In player versus, or cooperative play, players versus villain track, what are the players playing to? And I think in that sense, the overarching theme I'm working on is uncovering villainous plots. So if it's player versus player with no arch villain, it's defeating like 3 to 5 mini bases. So player to player would be like, you've defeated Martian masterminds and lunar Amazon piracy plan, or and a Mercury smuggling operation. And so you've got those 3. Once you've got those 3 bases that you've defeated, then you know, if you're the first one to achieve that, you are the hero. You win the game. If you're doing an arch villain game, I feel like something essentially similar. You've defeated 3 of, or you or everybody else available. Oh, how do I want to do that? Like, if I think the arch villain scheme deck should be 12 plots, and they only have to win 3 to 5 of them, and that means that each time you play it, a different series of plots string together in a way. So if the villain has no more ability to achieve 3 to 5, so like if you have a deck of 12 things for the arch villain to do, and they can only successfully achieve 2 of them, then they've already lost. So that's the villain version of it. So player versus player would be defeating a number of opponents. Or do I want it to be possible for one player to kill another player so that they can't continue to play? I don't think I want to do that. That shouldn't be the focus. I think every time there's ship-to-ship combat, you might be able to destroy their ship, but they get away in an escape pod. They have to start back home again. So if you're a Venusian and I'm a Martian and we get into a ship-to-ship combat, I defeat your ship, you start back at Venus again. All right, so that makes sense. Yeah, we're an hour and a half in. I'm going to puzzle out a little bit more of this tonight. I got to work on a few other things too, but I will come back with updates and more information tomorrow as to where I am on this one. All right. Have a good one and take care of yourselves. Yeah.